Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 30th, 2026. What a week it's been. Just new threats of wars, the danger of the blowout of the bond market, especially starting from Japan, the continued saga of Ukraine, Russia, U.S. talks. But I'm going to answer, since it's Friday, I'm going to take a question that came from a number of people, which is, what's behind the obsession with regime change in Iran? Now, this is back on the front burner following the June 2025 couple days war between the U.S. and Israel against Iran. There are threats going back and forth. So I want to review this, starting with what was said yesterday by British Prime Minister Starmer, who, look, we have to acknowledge Starmer is following the British tradition of being at the center of provoking regime change wars, dragging the United States into these wars. And it's time for the U.S. to end the special relationship before the end of the special relationship ends the U.S. Now, Starmer yesterday gave full support to the threats from Trump and Rubio against Iran. Donald Trump threatened to send a massive armada, which he said is moving quickly with great power, enthusiasm, and purpose towards Iran. And he said if Iran does not come to the table, then the next attack will be far worse than the one in June 2025. Now, this is clearly seen as a threat because the U.S. has moved an armada into the region. And then you get the comments from Starmer, who said that he agrees that Iran must not go ahead with its nuclear program. Well, Iran has said it's not going ahead with the nuclear program. And in fact, it had not been, but it was abiding by the JCPOA agreement, which was ended by none other than Donald Trump in his first term. Now, Starmer said that Iran not going ahead with its nuclear program is the number one priority, and that's what we're working on, despite the fact that there's no evidence that Iran is continuing to work toward building a nuclear weapon. Now, Starmer and Trump were backed up by Rubio in testimony to the Congress. Little Marco said that the U.S. has 30,000 to 40,000 troops in the region, in 8 or 9 facilities. He said all are within reach of Iran's ballistic missiles, therefore threatening American lives, and we must have a, quote, preemptive defensive option, unquote. The first question is it Iran's fault that the U.S. has deployed 30 to 40,000 troops into the region? That was a decision made by the United States to put pressure on Iran or to attack and destroy the current regime in Iran. So, to use this as an excuse is a fraud. Now, at the same time, Rubio issued some threats against Venezuela that if they don't continue to go along with the United States, there's a threat of military action against them. So regime change is still on the agenda in Venezuela and Iran. Now, where does this come from as far as Iran is concerned? Well, if you go back to the pre-World War I British policy, you can find all you need to know about why there's an obsession with Iran. The concern for the British was that Iran might be an entry point for the Russian Empire to move in on the Indian subcontinent. And therefore, they were constantly skirmishing the so-called Great Game in Afghanistan with British and Russian troops fighting. But also, Iran was a center of conflict. And so the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention adopted an agreement which pledged non-British interference in the northern third of the country, that is, leave it to the Russians, and the Russians would have no involvement in the southern third of the country, and the middle third was a no man's land. Now, this is all part of the great game, the British effort to protect the control of land and sea routes through the so-called Middle East. And what was behind this was their fear that the Russians would move through Central Asia into the Indian subcontinent. Now, the British focus on this was very intensive. You had the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905, in which the British funded the Japanese buildup. And the Russian army was significantly weakened. The empire was weakened by this conflict. There was also the concern that the British had with Germany, that Germany was building a Berlin to Baghdad railroad, which could undermine British deep sea influence in controlling trade and so on in the region. And the British were also working on the longer term project of replacing the Ottoman Empire as the central power in that region. So with all that going on, they decided to divide Iran into three separate parts. Now, you had other things going on at the time, which were the predecessor to World War I. You had, for example, the Young Turk uprising in 1908, and the Young Turks were part of a Young Europe project of the British to recruit young so-called nationalists to weaken the empires for the benefit of the British Empire. You had the Balkan War in 1912-1913, which preceded the assassination of the Archduke and the mobilization for World War I. Now, after World War I, you had the British moves to consolidate an American alliance, the Anglo-American alliance, as a way of protecting the interests of the British Empire as the British military and economy were weakening compared to those countries around them. And this was an obsession of the British leading into World War II. Now, when you had, in terms of Iran, the British were still working with the Russians. There was 1941, an Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. And after the war, the British moved to restore the regime of the Shah, to strengthen it. But there was an election in 1951 of a nationalist named Mossadegh in Iran, who moved to nationalize the oil. And that oil company was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And the idea that somehow the Iranians should have control over this infuriated the British to the extent that they mobilized to get a U.S. support through a man named Kermit Roosevelt, relative of Teddy Roosevelt, who was a CIA operative, to bring the CIA in on the side of the British for the overthrow of Mossadegh. And that was the coup in 1953, after the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had been nationalized in 1951. 1953, it was retaken with the overthrow of Mossadegh. Now, the period from then to the present has been one of constant intervention by the U.S., including actually it was the British and the French who were at the forefront of the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. There was the Iran-Iraq War during the 80s, which significantly weakened both countries, but in which both countries were armed and supported by the West. Now, it brings us to today, where Iran is again a focal point. And the real focus on Iran is from Israel, because Israel sees Iran as the center of resistance to a greater Israel project, which has been moving very aggressively over the last 30 years. And so with this in mind, we see the threats from Trump, the support for those threats from Starmer, the movements of troops, and the danger of a war breaking out that could be World War III. Now, what's the main point here? there's no solution to this situation within the realm of British geopolitics. That is, if the idea is to somehow contain an Iranian national response, or an Iraqi national response, or a Libyan national response, if their intent is to undermine that and to force these countries to remain dependent on an Anglo-American military backing and a Western financial control, then these situations will continue to worsen as they have been over the last 30 years. So the solution is to get out of the whole agenda, which is controlled by the British, and move away from this imperial geopolitical doctrine to one in which the legitimate security rights and development rights of each country are protected, and that each country has a right to develop its raw materials as a part of developing its population, improving the living standard of everybody in these countries to make them more capable of self-government. And so that's what's at stake right now. That's what the battle is all about. It's not just about Iranian oil. It's not just about Iranian nukes. It's not just about Iran versus Israel. It's about sustaining an order in that region in which the primary concern is focused on protecting the interests of the British geopolitical entity. And as long as that's the central focus, the danger of war remains. It doesn't have to be there. It could easily be changed. But we have to have a complete commitment to the development of a new strategic and development architecture. And that's what we've been fighting for. That's what the Schiller Institute is doing. That's what will be discussed again today at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the International Peace Coalition Zoom call. I'll be discussing this later today in a continuing series of interviews with Garland Nixon titled Perfidious Albion, a review of the whole question of the British role in provoking regime change wars. So stay with us, join us. Our fight is your fight. It's the fight to establish a secure, safe, developing world of sovereign nation states acting in the interests of their own population. So thanks for joining us this week. Share these videos, sign up for the Executive Intelligence Review Daily News, and we'll see you again.